Black Boy spent his last $7 helping a stranded Hell's Angel. 300 bikers returned at dawn. The sound came before the light did. A low rumble, far off, like thunder that forgot to stop rolling. It rattled the window panes of Willow Bend, Kentucky before the sun had even decided to climb over the ridge. Porch lights flicked on up and down Cypress Street, one after another, curtains pulled back by sleepy hands. And there, kneeling on the cracked concrete steps of a little white house with peeling shutters, was a mountain of a man in a leather vest, his gray beard damp with morning dew, holding something small and precious in his big scarred hands. In front of him stood an 11-year-old boy in plaid pajama pants, one hand pressed to his mouth, eyes wide as saucers, staring past the kneeling man to the street behind him. A street that no longer looked like Cypress Street at all. It looked like a river of chrome and leather, motorcycle after motorcycle after motorcycle, stretching back so far the tail end of it disappeared into the orange haze of the rising sun. 300 bikers, parked, waiting, silent. "Jariah," the kneeling man said, his voice thick with something the boy didn't have a word for yet. "I need you to hear me good, son. What you did 2 nights ago, you got no idea what you did. That's where this story starts, but it's not where it begins. To understand what brought 300 motorcycles to a quiet street in Willow Bend before sunrise, you have to go back. 2 nights, to be exact. Back to the rain, and the Sinclair station on the corner of Route 60, and a boy who had exactly $7 to his name. 2 nights earlier, Adaze Bellamy worked nights at the VA hospital 40 minutes outside town, which meant Jariah spent most evenings alone in the little white house his father built additions onto with his own 2 hands before he shipped out the last time and never came home. Jariah didn't mind the quiet, mostly. He'd learned to fill it. Homework at the kitchen table. Dishes washed and dried before his mother got back, so she wouldn't have one more thing waiting on her. And every Friday, without fail, he'd take the mason jar down from the top shelf of his closet. The one with a strip of masking tape across the front that read, in his own careful 11-year-old handwriting, "New sneakers, September." And he'd count it. 8 months he'd been saving, mowing the Pattersons' lawn, collecting cans along the ditch on Route 60 on Saturday mornings before anyone else woke up to beat him to them, skipping the ice cream truck all summer, which had cost him something real, because Jariah loved orange creamsicles the way some boys loved baseball. $41. That's what sat in that jar the night the rain came down sideways and the wind rattled the loose gutter above his bedroom window. His father's photograph sat on the shelf beside that jar. Sergeant Emeka Bellamy in his dress uniform, chin up. A smile that Jariah had been told over and over by relatives at the funeral was identical to his own. Jariah didn't remember much of his father firsthand. He remembered the smell of motor oil because Emeka had been a mechanic before the Army and never lost the habit of tinkering with anything that had an engine. He remembered being lifted onto broad shoulders at a 4th of July parade. He remembered a deep laugh that shook a whole room. Everything else he'd built from stories, the ones his mother told at bedtime, half memory and half prayer, and the ones the men from Mount Pisgah AME Zion Church told after service. Clapping him on the shoulder and saying, "You got his walk, boy. I'd know that walk anywhere." What Jariah understood, in the particular way an 11-year-old understands grief he never fully got to feel, was that his father had died owing nothing to anybody, and that his mother worked double shifts to make sure that stayed true. So when he saw a final notice stamped in red across that electric bill, it didn't feel like just a piece of paper. It felt like a stain on something his father built, and Jariah wasn't about to let it stand. His mother had left him a note that morning, the way she always did, tucked under the sugar bowl, "Light bill due Friday. Don't forget to check the mail, baby. Love you to the moon." Jariah checked the mail, and when he saw the red stamp across the front of the electric bill, "Final notice," something in his stomach dropped the way it did on the church swings when you went too high. He didn't think twice. He took the jar down, counted out $34, and walked it to Miss Ruthie's diner where his mother's friend Delphine worked the register, because Delphine had a way of getting bill money where it needed to go without making a woman feel small for needing help. That left $7 in the jar. $7 and a boy walking home in the rain with his hood up, thinking about how September was still a long way off, and maybe his sneakers could hold on a little longer. That's when he saw the man. The Sinclair station sat on the corner where Route 60 bent hard toward the county line, its green dinosaur sign buzzing weakly against the storm. And parked crooked beside the second pump, engine dead, headlight cracked, sat the biggest motorcycle Jariah had ever seen in his life. And beside it, soaked clean through, sat the biggest man Jariah had ever seen in his life. He had to be 6.5 feet of solid muscle gone soft with age, a gray beard braided at the chin, a black bandana wrapped tight over his skull, and a leather vest so covered in patches and pins it looked like a map of a life lived hard. Across the back of that vest, wings. Big, stitched, weathered wings. There was blood on his forehead, thin and pink from the rain washing it, running down past his temple. "Sir?" The word was out of Jeriah's mouth before he decided to say it. The man looked up slow, like it cost him something. "You should get on home, son. Ain't a night to be out. You're bleeding." "I've bled worse." He tried to smile, and it came out crooked with pain. "Some fool ran me off the road about a mile back. Took my wallet right out my saddlebag while I was checking the damage. Phone's dead. Bike's dry. And apparently—" He nodded toward the little station store, where the young clerk stood with his arms crossed behind the glass door, watching them both like they were a problem he intended to wait out. "Apparently a man my size, dressed like this, ain't the kind of customer they in a hurry to help." Jeriah looked at the clerk. The clerk looked away first. A truck pulled in behind them while they talked, headlights cutting through the rain, wipers slapping, and a man got out to use the pump on the far side. He glanced over at the biker sitting soaked and bleeding on the curb, then at Jeriah standing there in his rain-soaked hoodie, and something in his face closed up like a door. He didn't say a word. He just filled his tank fast, eyes forward, and got back in his truck and drove off into the storm, like neither of them were worth the trouble of noticing. Then a woman came out of the store with a bag of chips and a soda, saw the scene, and actually crossed to the far side of the lot to get to her car, giving the pumps where Jeriah stood a wide, deliberate berth. She didn't look at either of them. She just walked faster. Jeriah had seen this before. Not this exact moment, but the shape of it. The way people could look straight through somebody and call it not seeing. His mother had a name for it. Willow Bend weather, she called it, dry as a bone. Some folks' hearts only forecast one way around here. The clerk inside cracked the door open just enough to be heard. "Look, kid, I don't need trouble tonight. Man like that comes rolling in here, no ID, no card, bleeding all over my lot. Company policy says I call it in if it looks like trouble." "He's not trouble," Jeriah said. "He's hurt. Not my problem to fix." The clerk crossed his arms. "This ain't a charity." "You got people you can call?" Jeriah asked. The man's jaw tightened just slightly. "Not close enough to matter tonight." Something about the way he said it, "not close enough to matter," made Jeriah's chest ache in a way he recognized. It was the same way it ached on father-son cookout day at school, when he sat at the folding table with his mother instead, and everybody was too kind about it, which somehow made it worse. Jeriah didn't say anything else. He turned and walked into the store, past the clerk who barely glanced at him, and he set $7 on the counter. All of it, every bill flattened smooth from being folded in that jar for months. $5 of gas on pump, too," he said. "And whatever's left, I want that first aid kit behind you and one of them turkey sandwiches." The clerk blinked at him. "That's for the biker?" "That's for a man who's hurt and hungry," Jeriah said, and something in his voice, some borrowed steadiness from a mother who'd spent her whole life being underestimated and proving people wrong anyway, made the clerk stop arguing and ring it up. Jeriah carried it all back out into the rain, set the sandwich and the first aid kit on the seat of the broken-down motorcycle. Started pumping the gas himself, because the man's hands, he now saw, were shaking too hard from the cold to work the nozzle. "Son," the big man's voice cracked. "Son, I can't take this from you. You don't even know me." "You looked like somebody's daddy," Jeriah said simply, not looking up from the pump. "Figured if it was my daddy stuck somewhere, I'd want somebody's boy to stop." The rain kept falling. The pump clicked off at $5 exactly. And the big man sat there on the wet curb with a $2 sandwich in his lap, and a stranger's whole savings evaporated into his gas tank. And something moved behind his eyes that looked, for just a second, like grief. "What's your name, son?" "Jeriah. Jeriah Bellamy." The man went very still. "Bellamy," he repeated, low, like he was tasting the word. "Your daddy? He in the service?" Jeriah's chest tightened the way it always did when strangers asked that question, because the answer never got easier to give. "Was. Army. He passed 4 years ago in Iraq." The big man closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet, and it wasn't the rain. "What was his name, son? Your daddy's name?" "Emeka. Emeka Bellamy." "Everybody called him Sarge, mostly." The man's whole body seemed to sag, like a rope had been holding him up and somebody just cut it. He pressed a fist to his chest, right over his heart, right over a patch on his vest that read, in faded gold thread, Chaplain. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "Lord have mercy." "Sir, you okay?" The man reached out, slow, careful, the way you'd reach for something you were afraid might not be real, and rested one enormous hand on top of Jeriah's rain-soaked head, the way you'd bless a child. "Jeriah," he said, and his voice broke clean in half saying it. "Boy, I have been looking for you for 7 years." Jeriah didn't understand. Not that night. He walked the man, who finally gave his name as Preacher, said it was what the boys in his unit always called him and it just stuck, to the diner, where Delphine let him dry off by the kitchen stove and patched the cut on his head proper. Delphine Augustin had run the register at Miss Ruthie's for 11 years, ever since she came up from Port-au-Prince by way of her sister in Miami, and she had a way of sizing up a man in about 4 seconds flat. She took one look at Preacher's split forehead, his shaking hands, and the boy standing loyal at his elbow, like a bodyguard half his size, and she didn't ask a single question. She just pulled the first aid kit from behind the counter and got to work. She said, dabbing at the cut with practiced hands. "You bleed like a man who don't stop for nothing. Sit still." "Yes, ma'am," Preacher said, and something in his voice made it sound like he meant it as more than manners. It was while Delphine was taping gauze to his temple that the bell over the diner door jangled, and Deputy Roy Halstead walked in, shaking rain off his hat, radio crackling low on his shoulder. He was young for a deputy, not yet 30, with the kind of eager, watchful face that came from wanting badly to be taken seriously by men twice his age. His eyes went straight to Preacher, the size of him, the leather, the wings stitched across his back, and then to Jeriah standing close beside him, and something shifted behind Halstead's eyes. Not quite suspicion. Not yet. Just a flicker of a story already half written in his head before anybody said a word. "Everything all right in here, Delphine?" he asked, not looking at her. "Everything's just fine, Roy," Delphine said, not looking up from her work. "Man had an accident on 60. This boy here was decent enough to help him." "That right." Halstead's gaze lingered on Preacher a beat too long, on the patches, the wings, the ink climbing out from under his collar. "You got ID, sir?" "Had it stolen tonight, along with my wallet," Preacher said evenly. No heat in it at all, though something steady and unbothered in his tone suggested he'd faced worse men than a small-town deputy plenty of times before. "Reported already, if you care to check." Halstead's jaw worked. He looked at Jeriah again, longer this time, and Jeriah felt that look settle on him like a weight. The particular weight of being a black boy in a small town, standing next to a stranger, under the eye of a man with a badge and something to prove. "You should be home, Jeriah," Halstead said finally. "It's late." "I was just walking him part way, sir. Heading home now." Halstead held his stare another second, like he was deciding whether that was the truth or not, and then he turned and walked back out into the rain without another word, radio crackling something Jeriah couldn't make out. Delphine watched him go, then shook her head slow. "That boy's been looking for a reason since the day they pinned that badge on him," she muttered, mostly to herself. "Lord, give him patience before he finds one." Preacher wouldn't say much more. Not that first night. Just kept looking at Jeriah like he was something rare and fragile, something he couldn't quite believe was standing in front of him. "You got somewhere to be, son?" Preacher finally asked, once his color came back. "Home. My mama works nights. I gotta be there when she calls to check on me." "Then let me walk you," Preacher said. "Long as this old leg of mine can still walk anybody anywhere." He didn't ask for the boy's address. He didn't need to. Willow Bend was small enough, and by the time they reached the little white house with the peeling shutters, Preacher had gone quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. He stood at the end of the driveway a long moment, staring at the house like it held ghosts. "This was his house," Preacher said, not a question. "He built the back porch himself," Jeriah said, "before he shipped out. Mama says he wanted us to have someplace to sit together when he got home." Preacher's jaw worked. He looked for one unguarded second, like a man standing at a grave. "Go on inside, Jeriah," he said finally, his voice rough. "Lock the door. And thank you. Thank you for what you did tonight. You don't know it yet, but you just paid a debt that's been unpaid a long, long time." Jeriah went inside, watched through the window as the big man walked back down Cypress Street into the rain, favoring one leg, disappearing into the dark like something out of a dream the boy would half convince himself he'd imagined by morning. He didn't tell his mother when she got home near dawn, exhausted, smelling of hospital antiseptic. He just hugged her extra long at the door, and when she asked why, he only said, "No reason. Just glad you're home safe." He didn't mention the jar was empty. He didn't know yet that word travels fast in a small town, that the diner clerk had already told 2 customers by breakfast, that the Sinclair clerk had mentioned it to his manager, that somewhere on a highway 40 miles east, Preacher Kavanaugh had pulled his motorcycle, repaired now, running, into a gas station, picked up a payphone with hands that still shook, and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "It's me," Preacher said when the line picked up. "I found him. I found Emeka's boy." There was a long silence on the other end. "You sure?" the voice asked. "I'm sure," Preacher said, and his voice cracked wide open. "Gather the chapter. Gather every chapter that'll answer. We're riding to Willow Bend, Kentucky, and we're not going empty-handed." He hung up the phone, looked east, toward the horizon where dawn was just beginning to gray the sky. "Hold on a little longer, Sarge," he whispered to no one, to the wind, to a promise 7 years old. "I'm bringing it home." What Jariah didn't know, what he couldn't have known, kneeling there in the rain with an empty jar and a full heart, was that his simple act of kindness had cracked open something far bigger than a stranded biker's bad night. It had reached back 7 years, into a war-torn outpost half a world away, into a promise made between 2 soldiers who never got the chance to keep it themselves. And it was about to collide, head-on, with a much darker story already unfolding in Willow Bend, one involving a deputy with something to prove, and a mayor with a secret he'd kill to protect. Small towns don't need newspapers to spread a story. They've got Miss Ruthie's, and church parking lots, and porches close enough to shout across. By the time Adaze Bellamy dragged herself home from her shift the next morning, bone-tired and smelling faintly of hand sanitizer and burnt coffee, the story of the Bellamy boy and the biker had already made its way through half of Willow Bend. She heard it first from Delphine, who called the house at 7:30 sharp, before Adaze had even gotten her shoes off. "Girl, that boy of yours," Delphine said, and Adaze could hear the smile in her voice even through the phone. "He's got his daddy's heart. I tell you that much." "Delphine, what are you talking about?" By the time Delphine finished telling it, the rain, the stolen wallet, the jar, the biker built like a mountain who'd gone pale as a ghost at the sound of Emeka's name. Adaze had sat down hard on the kitchen chair, one hand pressed flat against her chest. She found Jariah still asleep, curled up the way he'd slept since he was small, one arm thrown over his eyes like he was hiding from the morning. She sat on the edge of his bed a long moment, just looking at him, before she gently shook his shoulder. "Baby," she said softly, "wake up. Tell me about the man from the gas station." Jariah's eyes opened slow, then went wide with something like guilt. "Mama, I know I wasn't supposed to spend the emergency money, but he was hurt, and nobody was going to help him, and—" "Jariah." Her voice cracked on his name. "You gave that man everything you had left?" He nodded, small, bracing for the disappointment he was sure was coming. Instead, his mother pulled him into her arms so tight it nearly knocked the breath out of him, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. She was fighting hard to hold back. "Your daddy," she whispered into his hair, "would be so proud of you right now he couldn't see straight." They sat like that a long while, mother and son, in the gray morning light of a house built by a man neither of them had gotten enough time with. Neither of them knew yet just how far that pride was about to travel, or how fast trouble was riding in behind it. The knock at the door. It came just after 9 that same morning. 3 sharp raps, official sounding, the kind that made your stomach drop before you even opened the door. Deputy Roy Halstead stood on the porch, hat in hand, a folded paper tucked under his arm, and behind him, parked at the curb in a car far too polished for a workday, sat Mayor Bradford Nash, watching from the passenger window without getting out. "Morning, Mrs. Bellamy." Halstead's voice had a stiffness to it, rehearsed. "I'm real sorry to bother you, but we've had a complaint." A complaint about what? Adaze crossed her arms, Jariah half hidden behind her in the doorway. "Code violation." Halstead unfolded the paper and held it out, not quite meeting her eyes. "Structural concerns with the back porch addition. Says here it wasn't permitted proper when it was built. City's gonna need you to bring it up to code or—" He trailed off. "Or what, Roy? Or there could be a fine. Possible condemnation of that section of the property if it's found unsafe." Adaze took the paper with hands that had gone very still, the particular stillness of a woman who had learned, over 4 years of grief and bureaucracy, exactly how much energy she could afford to spend on anger before it cost her something she needed more. "My husband built that porch with his own 2 hands," she said, quiet and level. "Inspected and permitted back in 2019. I have the paperwork in a drawer not 10 feet from where you're standing." "Well, ma'am, this is a new complaint filed by who, Roy?" Halstead's jaw tightened. He glanced back toward the car at the curb, toward Mayor Nash, who offered nothing but a thin, patient smile through the glass. "That's not something I'm at liberty to say, ma'am." A Daisy looked past him, straight at the mayor's car, and something in her gaze made even Nash's smile falter just slightly before he looked away, out toward the street, like he'd suddenly found something fascinating there. "You tell your mayor," Adaze said, folding the paper in half, then in half again, with a precision that felt like its own kind of statement, "that I'll be at City Hall Monday morning with my paperwork, my lawyer's number, and my late husband's name on the deed to this house. And you tell him I said good morning." She shut the door, gently but firmly, and stood with her back against it a long moment, breathing. "Mama?" Jariah's voice was small. "Are we in trouble?" Adaze looked down at her son, and something fierce and steady moved behind her eyes. The same look, though Jariah didn't know it yet, that his father used to get right before he did something brave. "No, baby," she said. "Somebody else is about to be." What the mayor wanted. What neither Adaze nor Jariah knew. What almost nobody in Willow Bend knew, save for a handful of men who met quietly at the back table of the Elks Lodge every second Thursday, was that Mayor Bradford Nash had spent the last 14 months brokering a deal with a development firm out of Louisville called Ridgeline Partners. The plan was simple, on paper. Buy up the aging block of Cypress Street, rezone it commercial, and bring in a shopping plaza that would, Nash liked to say at council meetings, finally put Willow Bend on the map. What he didn't say at council meetings was the finder's fee written into his private arrangement with Ridgeline, a fee that scaled with how quickly and cleanly the parcels came together. 12 of the 14 houses on that stretch of Cypress had already sold, some willingly, some after code violations and back tax notices mysteriously appeared on doorsteps that had never had trouble before. Only 2 houses remained. One belonged to an elderly widower named Otis Freeman, who Nash figured would fold soon enough once his hip surgery bills came due. The other belonged to Adaze Bellamy, and it sat, inconveniently, dead center of the parcel Ridgeline wanted most. Nash had told himself more than once that it wasn't personal, that progress required sacrifice, and somebody's house was always going to be in the way of somebody's plan. He told himself Adaze would get a fair price. He told himself a lot of things late at night that let him sleep. What he hadn't counted on was a story about his target's son making the front page of the Willow Bend Courier the very next morning. Local boy's kindness to stranded biker touches town, with a photograph, grainy but unmistakable, of Jariah standing at the gas pump in the rain 2 nights before, snapped by the store's security camera and leaked gladly by a clerk eager for his 15 minutes of relevance. Suddenly, the Bellamy house wasn't just a parcel of land standing between Nash and his fee. It was a story. And stories, Nash knew from long political experience, had a way of making inconvenient things very hard to quietly remove. On the road east, 230 miles away, in a garage behind a clubhouse with a sign reading Iron Kingdom MC, founded 1974, a phone rang on the wall, and a woman with silver dreadlocks and forearms like braided rope picked it up before the second ring. "Iron Kingdom." "Ruth, it's Preacher." Ruth Calloway, everyone called her Ruth Iron, had for 30 years. Ever since she rode her Harley clean across 3 states with a broken collarbone rather than miss her father's funeral, set down the wrench she'd been holding, and gave the phone her full attention. Something in Preacher's voice, low and cracked open, told her this call was different from the usual. "You sound like a man who saw a ghost," she said. "Better than a ghost," Preacher said. "I found him, Ruth. I found Emika's boy." The line went quiet a long moment. Ruth had known Preacher Kavanaugh for going on 15 years, since before he'd earned the name, back when he was just a broken-down Army chaplain who'd come home from 3 deployments carrying more weight than any one man's shoulders should have to hold. She was one of the only people alive who knew the whole story of Emeka Bellamy, knew what the man had done for Preacher in the worst hour of his life, and what Preacher had sworn, kneeling in the dirt of a forward outpost with Emeka's blood still on his hands, that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to repay. "You sure it's him?" Ruth asked, though her voice already carried the answer. Same walk his daddy had, same steady eyes. Boy gave a stranger every dollar he had in this world without blinking, Ruth. Just like his father would have. Just like his father did, the night that mattered most. Preacher's voice broke clean on the last words. I owe that family a debt I've been carrying 7 years, and I mean to pay it all the way. What do you need? Gather the chapter, Preacher said. Every chapter that'll answer the call. I want every man who ever rode with Emeka Bellamy's unit, every brother who remembers what that man did for us over there, standing on that boy's street by sunrise. We're not going empty-handed, Ruth. We're bringing everything we've got. Ruth was already moving, already reaching for the CB radio bolted to the garage wall, already running through the mental list of chapters within striking distance. Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Ohio, even a few brothers as far out as Indiana who'd want to be there for this. How many you thinking? However many show up, Preacher said. I have a feeling it's going to be more than either of us expects. He was right. City Hall a Days didn't wait for Monday. She called in a favor Saturday morning from her cousin Fola Sade, a paralegal 2 counties over, and by that afternoon she was standing in the cramped records office of Willow Bend City Hall with the manila folder full of permits, inspection reports, and a deed with Emeka Bellamy's name on it in ink that had never once needed defending until now. The clerk behind the counter, a nervous young woman named Patty Sue Higgins, flipped through Addie's paperwork with visibly growing discomfort. Ma'am, this all looks to be in order, Patty Sue said, glancing toward the closed door of the mayor's office like she was hoping someone would come rescue her from this conversation. I don't understand why a new complaint would have been filed if the original permits were... I don't need you to understand it, Patty Sue, Adaz said, not unkindly. I need you to log that I was here, that I brought proof, and that I expect a written retraction of this violation notice by end of business Wednesday. Otherwise, my lawyer will be filing something of her own, against the city, for harassment. Patty Sue's eyes went wide. She glanced again at the mayor's door, behind which the muffled sound of Bradford Nash's voice could be heard, low and urgent, on a phone call he clearly didn't want overheard. I'll make sure it's logged, Mrs. Bellamy. Thank you. Adaz gathered her folder, tucked it under her arm, and paused at the door. One more thing. Otis Freeman got a notice too, didn't he? Back tax letter out of nowhere right around the same time as mine? Patty Sue's silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, Adaz said quietly, and walked out into the Saturday sun. She found Otis on his porch 2 streets over that same afternoon, his cane propped against the rail, a glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand. He was 81 years old, had buried a wife and outlived 2 hip replacements, and had lived in his house on Cypress Street since before the street had streetlights. They come at you too? Otis asked, before she'd even finished climbing his steps. Back tax notice, fake violation on mine. Adaz sat heavy in the chair beside him. Otis, what is going on with this street? Otis Freeman took a long, slow sip of his tea, the kind of pause that belonged to a man who'd learned patience was often the only weapon left available to him. Man from some company out of Louisville came by here about a year back, he said finally. Real smooth talker. Offered me good money for this house. More than it's worth, if I'm honest. I told him no. Told him my wife's buried 2 blocks from here, and I intend to die in this house same as she did in hers. He shook his head slow. Notices started coming not 2 months after that. Adaz felt something cold settle in her stomach. You think the mayor's involved? I think, Otis said, that Bradford Nash has been awful quiet about where his campaign money's coming from these past 2 years. And I think a man don't get that quiet about money unless he's got a real good reason to. They sat together on that porch a long while, 2 neighbors who'd never had much reason to compare notes before, slowly realizing they were looking at the same conspiracy from 2 different doors. I'm going to find out what's really going on here, Otis, Adaz said finally, standing to leave, one way or another. I believe you will, Adaz Bellamy. Otis raised his tea glass in something like a toast. You always were your mother's daughter, stubborn as a Kentucky mule, God rest her soul. She managed a small, tired laugh, the first one in days, and walked home as the sun began its long slide toward evening, unaware that 200 miles east, phones were already ringing across 4 states, and a small army was gathering to ride to her door. The chapter answers the call. Ruth Calloway had run Iron Kingdom's Kentucky chapter for 11 years, and in that time she'd learned there were calls you made when you needed backup for a run, and there were calls you made when you needed something closer to a resurrection. This was the second kind. By Saturday night, the CB radio in the clubhouse garage hadn't gone quiet in 6 hours. Chapter after chapter checked in. Bluegrass riders out of Lexington, Cumberland Gap MC from over the Tennessee line, 3 separate charters from West Virginia coal country, even a contingent from an Ohio Veterans Riding Club that had never formally partnered with Iron Kingdom before, but showed up anyway, once word reached them exactly whose son this ride was for. "Sergeant Emeka Bellamy," Ruth said into the radio, over and over, to every new voice that checked in. Man who pulled Preacher Kavanaugh out of a burning transport under fire and carried him 2 miles on a shattered ankle rather than leave a brother behind. Died 8 months later doing the same thing for somebody else. His boy just gave a stranded stranger every dollar he owned without blinking. "We are riding to Willow Bend, Kentucky to make sure that family never again wonders if anybody remembers what Emeka Bellamy did." Nobody who heard that story said no. By Sunday afternoon, Ruth had counted confirmations past 200, with more rolling in by the hour. Men and women on Harleys and Indians and old restored Triumphs, packing saddlebags not with weapons but with groceries, tools, cash pooled quietly from wallets that didn't have much to spare but gave anyway, and a battered box of children's sneakers in every size Ruth could think to grab, just in case. Preacher stood in the garage doorway that evening, watching his people gather, the folded letter still tucked against his heart, where it had lived for 7 years. "You ready for this?" Ruth asked him, quiet, just between the two of them. "I've been ready for 7 years," Preacher said. "I just didn't know where to bring it. And now you do. Now I do." He looked east toward Kentucky, toward a little white house he'd stood in front of 2 nights before without knowing yet what it would come to mean. "Let's go bring a family home what's owed them. The fault line cracks open. By Saturday afternoon, Willow Bend had split cleanly into 2. There were those who saw the newspaper photograph and felt something warm and hopeful stir in their chest. The church mothers of Mount Pisgah, who organized a special prayer circle for that sweet Bellamy boy. Otis Freeman, who hobbled over on his cane just to shake Jeriah's hand and tell him gruffly that his father would have done the exact same thing, not a soul in town surprised by that. And there were those, quieter but no less present, who muttered about outsiders and trouble coming to town, and eyed the increasing chatter about motorcycles gathering somewhere out on Route 60 with open suspicion. Deputy Halstead found himself fielding calls all Saturday from residents worried about a biker gang descending on Willow Bend, and each call seemed to feed something hungry and anxious in him, a need to be ready, to be the one who kept the town safe, to prove to Mayor Nash and Sheriff Combs and anybody watching that he was more than just the young deputy who'd let a suspicious stranger walk free from Miss Ruthie's 2 nights before. By Saturday evening, Halstead had convinced himself of something dangerous, that whatever was riding toward Willow Bend was a threat that needed meeting with force, not welcome. He requested backup from the county. He pulled up old intelligence bulletins about outlaw motorcycle clubs, most of it outdated, some of it flatly wrong, none of it accounting for the difference between the clubs that ran drugs and the ones, like Iron Kingdom, that ran food banks and toy drives and veteran support lines from the very same clubhouses. Mayor Nash, for his part, saw opportunity in the chaos. A biker gang, descending on a town he was quietly trying to redevelop, made for a very convenient headline, one that could paint the whole Cypress Street situation as a neighborhood spiraling out of control, ripe for the kind of revitalization only Ridgeline partners could provide. He picked up his phone and dialed the county paper himself. "I think," he said smoothly, once the reporter picked up, "the good people of Willow Bend deserve to know what's headed their way at dawn." The cliffhanger Sunday night, the sky over Willow Bend hung heavy and orange with the last light of day, and a dazed Bellamy stood on her back porch, the same porch her husband built, the same porch a fake code violation had tried to condemn, watching the horizon like she could already hear something coming. Jeriah sat beside her on the top step, the empty mason jar cradled in his lap, turning it over slow in his hands. "Mama," he said quietly, "you think that man, Preacher, you think he's going to be okay?" "I think," Adaize said, wrapping an arm around her son's shoulders, "that some debts take a long time to come due. And when they finally do, baby, they come due all at once." Down at the county line, unseen by either of them, the first headlight appeared on Route 60, one small point of light in the deepening dark. Behind it, a second, a third. Within the hour, they stretched back over the hill in a chain that seemed to have no end, engines growling low like a storm gathering strength. And at the front of that chain rode a man with a 7-year-old letter folded carefully in the inside pocket of his vest, close to his heart, close enough to feel it beating. Deputy Halstead stood at the edge of town with 3 county cruisers behind him, hand resting near his belt, watching that wall of light grow larger on the horizon, utterly certain he was about to face down trouble. He had no idea he was about to watch the truth arrive instead. What none of them understood yet, not Halstead bracing for a fight, not Nash rubbing his hands together over a headline, not even a Days on her porch, was that the 300 riders bearing down on Willow Bend carried something far more powerful than any threat. They carried a promise sealed for 7 years, about to be spoken aloud for the very first time. And when it was spoken, it would not just answer the question of who Preacher Kavanaugh was to Jeriah's father. It would answer the question of who Jeriah's father had truly been, a truth about to shatter every quiet lie Willow Bend had let itself believe. Deputy Roy Halstead had never seen anything like it in his life, and he would tell people years later that no amount of training could have prepared him for the sound. It started as a rumble on the edge of hearing, somewhere past the county line, and grew, not fast, not sudden, but steady and relentless, like the earth itself had decided to clear its throat, until it filled the whole sky over Willow Bend. By the time the first headlight crested the hill on Route 60, Halstead's hand had drifted to his belt without him quite deciding to put it there, and the 2 county cruisers behind him had their light bars spinning, throwing red and blue against the gray pre-dawn houses. "Sweet Jesus," muttered Deputy Combs, standing beside him. "How many is that?" Halstead didn't answer. He couldn't. He was doing the math in his head, and the math kept getting worse. 50, then 100, then more than he could count. Motorcycles stretching back over the hill in a river that didn't seem to have an end, running in tight, disciplined formation, headlights cutting clean lines through the dark. At the front of that river rode a man Halstead recognized immediately, even from a distance, the size, the beard, the wings on the back of his vest. The man from Miss Ruthie's, the one he'd questioned 4 nights before. Halstead stepped into the middle of Route 60, one hand raised, the other resting, white-knuckled, near his sidearm. "This road is closed to unauthorized assembly," he called out, his voice cracking despite his best effort to keep it steady. "You need to turn this procession around, right now." The lead rider, Preacher, slowed his bike to an idle, and behind him, in a wave that rippled backward through 300 riders, like a held breath being released, engine after engine dropped to idle too, until the roar softened to a low, patient growl. Preacher pulled off his helmet. His eyes, in the growing light, were red-rimmed and steady. "Deputy," he said, calm as still water, "we're not here for trouble. We're here for a boy named Jeriah Bellamy, and we mean him and his mother nothing but honor. You can stand in this road all morning if you need to feel useful, son. But I promise you, we are not turning around." "I'll call for backup from 3 counties, Halstead said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Call whoever you need to call," Preacher said, not unkindly, "but you might want to know who you're calling backup on first." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest, slow, deliberate, no threat in the motion at all, and drew out a small laminated card, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. He held it out toward Halstead. It was a photograph. A younger Preacher, maybe 15 years younger, in army fatigues, arms slung around the shoulders of a black soldier grinning wide at the camera, both of them caked in desert dust, both of them alive with the particular joy of men who'd survived something together. "That's Sergeant Emeka Bellamy," Preacher said. "That's the man who pulled me out of a burning vehicle under enemy fire and carried me 2 miles on a busted ankle because he refused to leave a brother behind. That's the boy's father, Deputy. And every single rider behind me either served with him or heard what he did, or is riding today because they believe a debt like that doesn't have an expiration date." Halstead stared at the photograph a long moment. Something in his chest, the same something that had made him suspicious of a stranded stranger 4 nights before, shifted, uncomfortably, toward shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Most folks don't," Preacher said. "That's usually how it goes, right before they find out." Behind them, on the hillside, the sky had begun to blush pink and gold, and somewhere in the crowd of houses on Cypress Street, a porch light flicked on. The door opens. Days Bellamy had been awake since 4, unable to sleep, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a growing dread she couldn't name. When the sound reached her house, that low, distant thunder, she went to the window first and then, heart hammering, to wake her son. "Jariah, baby, wake up. I need you to come see this." They stood together on the front porch as the procession came into view down Cypress Street, 300 motorcycles rolling slow and orderly past the little houses, engines a steady rumbling murmur now instead of a roar, until the lead rider, the man Jariah recognized instantly, even changed as he was, heeled and dry and dressed in the full colors of his club, pulled to a stop directly in front of their house. Preacher swung off his bike, walked up the short path to the porch steps with the careful, reverent pace of a man approaching an altar. And there, in front of his mother and 300 silent witnesses, he lowered himself down onto one knee before an 11-year-old boy in plaid pajama pants. "Jariah," he said, and this time his voice didn't crack. It simply broke open, honest and unguarded. "I need you to hear me good, son. What you did 4 nights ago. You got no idea what you did." This was the moment from the very beginning of the story. The flash the tale had opened on, finally caught up to itself, finally given its context. Preacher reached into his vest and drew out an envelope, yellowed and soft at the creases from 7 years of careful handling. Amika Bellamy's handwriting still visible and steady across the front. "For my son. When he's old enough to understand what it means to be a man." "Your daddy wrote this the night before the mission that took his life," Preacher said, his hands trembling slightly as he held it out. "He gave it to me because he said if anything happened to him, he trusted me to find you when the time was right and put it in your hands myself. I have carried this letter for 7 years, Jariah, through 3 states and I don't know how many miles. I looked for you every chance I got, but the trail always went cold. Your mama moved after the funeral, and the paperwork with the army got tangled, and I started to believe I might carry this to my own grave without ever finding you." His voice caught, and for a moment the massive man knelt there on the steps, 7-year-old grief plain and unashamed on his face in front of 300 of his brothers and sisters. "And then 4 nights ago," he continued, "a boy with an empty gas tank and a bleeding stranger crossed the street with his very last $7, because, and I quote you exactly, son, you said I looked like somebody's daddy." He shook his head, slow, wonder plain in his voice. "You had no earthly idea, but something in you knew anyway. That's your father in you, Jariah. That's Amika Bellamy, plain as day." Jariah's hands shook as he took the envelope. His mother stood behind him, both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely now, and around them 300 bikers sat their idling machines in absolute silence, a river of leather and chrome bowed in reverence to a moment none of them would ever forget. "Read it, baby," Adiz whispered. "Whenever you're ready." Jariah's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. The paper inside was thin, worn soft, the ink slightly faded but still legible in his father's careful, deliberate handwriting. The handwriting of a mechanic, precise and unhurried even when writing what he must have known might be his last words to his son. He read it aloud, his young voice cracking on nearly every line, and the whole street went still enough to hear a pin drop. "My son, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home to tell you these things myself, and there's no apology big enough for that, so I won't waste ink trying. What I want you to know is this: being a man isn't about how big you get or how tough you look. It's about what you do when nobody's making you do it. It's about giving when you don't have enough to give, and staying honest when lying would be easier, and standing up for people even when standing up costs you something. Your mama is the strongest person I have ever known, and if you take care of her, and you take care of whoever's in front of you that needs help, then you'll be exactly the man I always hoped you'd become. I love you more than I ever found the words for. Make me proud, Dad." Jariah lowered the letter, tears streaming freely down his face now, and looked up at his mother, who sank down onto the porch steps beside him and pulled him into her arms, both of them shaking with a grief and a joy too large and too tangled to separate. Not one person on that street, not the 300 riders, not Deputy Halstead standing at the edge of the crowd with his hat now removed and held over his heart, not the neighbors who'd stepped out onto their own porches to watch, made a sound. It was Otis Freeman, leaning on his cane at the edge of his own yard, who finally broke the silence, his voice cracking with an old man's unguarded emotion. "That boy," Otis called out to no one and everyone, "is his father made new." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and one by one riders began dismounting, not out of any signal, just the natural instinct of people who'd traveled hours to bear witness and now found themselves needing to be closer to what they'd witnessed. An older rider with a gray-streaked beard and a POW-MIA patch stitched crooked on his vest stepped forward first, holding out a small, wrapped bundle to Jiraiya with hands that shook slightly. "Name's Delacroix Guillory," he said, voice thick with a Louisiana drawl gone soft with age. "Rode with your daddy's unit for 8 months. He gave me his last ration bar once, middle of the worst week of my life. Didn't think twice about it. Been carrying something for you a long while, hoping I'd get the chance." He pressed the bundle into Jiraiya's hands. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, sat a small carved wooden cross, worn smooth from years of handling. "Your daddy carved these for the whole unit out of scrap wood. Said it kept his hands busy and his mind on home. This one was mine. Think it's time it went to you." Behind him, a woman named Chiamaka Osei, Nigerian-American, riding with the Ohio Veterans Chapter, whose late husband had served 2 tours alongside Emeka, knelt down to press a small photograph into Adaizi's hands. Emeka, laughing beside a jeep, dust-caked and grinning, a version of him neither Adais nor Jiraiya had ever seen. One by one, riders came forward. Some offered small gifts, patches, coins, worn photographs, a harmonica somebody swore Emeka used to play badly but enthusiastically around the campfire. Others simply knelt, briefly, on the porch steps, murmuring thanks that had waited 7 years to be spoken. Ruth Iron arrived last, setting down a battered cardboard box overflowing with children's sneakers in every size, and pressed Adaizi's hand between both of hers. "We didn't know his shoe size," Ruth said, a little embarrassed, "so we brought a little of everything." Jiraiya, overwhelmed, looked up at Preacher. "Why did you carry that letter so long? Why didn't you just mail it or something?" Preacher's jaw tightened, old grief resurfacing plain on his face. "Because your daddy didn't just hand me that letter, son. He handed it to me during the mission that took his life, the same mission where he pulled me out of that burning transport. I was half-conscious, bleeding out, certain I was about to die right there in the dirt, and your father held that letter against my chest and made me swear, if I lived and he didn't, I'd find you myself and put it in your hands. Not mail it, not send it through some office. Put it in your hands." His voice cracked. "I made a promise to a dying man's last act of faith in me, Jiraiya. That's not the kind of promise you keep halfway." Adais, listening, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears falling freely again. "He never told me," she whispered. "In all his letters home, he never once mentioned—" "He wouldn't have," Preacher said gently. "Your husband wasn't a man who talked about the hard things until they were already handled. He'd have wanted you to remember him steady, not scared." He looked down at Jiraiya. "But he was scared, son. Same as any man facing what he was facing. He was just braver than the fear. That's the whole difference. Not being unafraid, but doing right anyway." Somewhere behind the bikers, a car door slammed. The break-it was Mayor Bradford Nash's polished sedan pulling up at the edge of the gathered crowd, and the timing could not have been worse for him, though he didn't yet know it. He'd come, ironically, hoping to use the spectacle to his advantage, planning to be photographed standing near the unruly gathering, ready to speak to the reporter from the county paper about restoring order to a neighborhood he'd been quietly trying to dismantle for over a year. What he got instead was a street full of 300 witnesses to a scene of raw, undeniable honor, and a reporter who was very clearly filming something entirely different from the story Nash had hoped to plant. Nash stepped out of his car, straightened his jacket, and made the fatal mistake of opening his mouth. "Now, I understand emotions are running high," he began, in the smooth, practiced tone he used at ribbon cuttings. "But this kind of gathering does raise real concerns about public safety on a residential street, and I think, Mr. Mayor—" Adaizi's voice cut through his, calm but carrying, honed sharp by years of standing her ground in hospital hallways against doctors who didn't want to listen. She rose from the porch steps, Jiraiya's letter still clutched in one hand. "Since you're here, perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone gathered why my late husband's porch, permitted and inspected in 2019, suddenly required a fraudulent code violation last week, or why my neighbor Otis Freeman received a back tax notice out of nowhere, right around the time he refused to sell his house to Ridgeline Partners." A murmur rippled through the crowd, bikers and neighbors alike, all eyes swinging toward Nash. Color drained from the mayor's face. "I have no idea what I have the paperwork, Mayor Nash," Adaizi said, steady as stone. "I have the notice with your signature authorizing the inspection request. I have my paralegal cousin's notes from City Hall records. And as of yesterday afternoon, I have a very interested reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal who's been looking into Ridgeline Partners' acquisition pattern across 4 different counties." The reporter from the county paper, standing at the edge of the crowd, lowered her phone slightly, eyes widening, scribbling something fast into her notebook. Nash opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. This is a private matter. This isn't the place. Actually, came a new voice, calm and unhurried, from the back of the crowd. I think it's exactly the place. A man stepped forward from among the bikers. Not one of the leather-clad riders, but a lean, sharp-eyed man in a plain gray jacket who'd arrived quietly among the procession without drawing much attention, riding pillion behind one of the Ohio veterans. Agent Marcus Whitfield, he said, holding up identification. FBI, Louisville Field Office. I've been investigating Ridgeline Partners' land acquisition practices for the past 4 months, Mayor Nash, following a pattern of suspicious code violations and tax notices across 3 counties that all seem to trace back to properties this firm was targeting. He glanced toward Adaize, something like respect in his eyes. Mrs. Bellamy's cousin reached out to a colleague of mine yesterday afternoon. Good timing, it turns out. The color that had drained from Nash's face was now replaced by something closer to gray. I'd like you to come with me, sir, Agent Whitfield said, stepping forward, and answer some questions about your financial arrangement with Ridgeline. Formally this time. Deputy Halstead, who had spent the last 4 days bracing for a fight against exactly the wrong enemy, stepped forward now, not to defend the mayor but to assist the agent, snapping into a posture of duty that felt, for the first time in days, entirely correct. Mayor Nash, Halstead said, and there was no eagerness in his voice now, only a young man's dawning understanding of what real justice actually looked like. I think you'd best go with the agent. Nash's shoulders sagged. He looked once desperately at the crowd, at the 300 silent riders, at his own neighbors, at Adaize Bellamy standing tall on her porch with her son's hand in hers, and found not one face offering him sympathy. This isn't over, he muttered, more to himself than anyone, as Agent Whitfield guided him toward an unmarked car. But it was. Everyone standing on that street that morning understood, with the particular clarity that only public unraveling can provide, that it absolutely was. What the investigation found. In the days that followed, Willow Bend learned the full shape of what had been happening on Cypress Street, piece by piece, as Agent Whitfield's investigation moved from quiet inquiry to formal indictment. Ridgeline Partners had paid Mayor Nash, over the previous 14 months, just under $200,000 in consulting fees funneled through a shell company registered to his brother-in-law in exchange for expedited rezoning approvals and, the part that turned Willow Bend's stomach, a quiet arrangement wherein the mayor's office would flag code concerns on properties whose owners refused to sell, using the town's own bureaucracy as a cudgel against its own citizens. 12 families had already sold, some at fair prices, some under duress they hadn't fully understood until the pattern was laid bare in the newspaper. Otis Freeman's back tax notice was voided within the week, the assessor's office issuing a rare public apology. Adaize's fraudulent code violation was struck from the record, and the city attorney, visibly uncomfortable in front of the cameras, confirmed that no further action would be taken against the Bellamy property. Nash was charged with wire fraud, extortion under color of official right, and a handful of related counts that would, over the following months, unravel not just his career but his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom. Deputy Halstead, for his part, gave a full statement cooperating with the investigation. And in the weeks after, something in him seemed to soften, sharpen, mature, all at once. He started showing up to Mount Pisgah's community breakfasts. He started, slowly, earning back a trust in Willow Bend's black community that he hadn't fully understood, until that morning he'd never actually had. But none of that, not the arrest, not the headlines, not the slow unraveling of a corrupt scheme, was the part of that morning Willow Bend would talk about for years to come. What they'd talk about was a boy on a porch, a letter from a father 7 years gone, and 300 motorcycles bowed in silence to honor a debt that money could never have paid. The scandal would occupy Willow Bend's attention for weeks, the lawyers, the headlines, the slow grinding wheels of federal justice. All of it mattered. All of it brought a kind of accountability the town badly needed. But for Jeriah Bellamy, standing on his porch with his father's letter pressed against his heart, none of that was really the point. The point was smaller and larger and far more permanent than any conviction could be. The point was that his father, gone 4 years, a photograph on a shelf, a story told at bedtime, had reached across time itself to tell him, in his own handwriting, exactly who he already was. And that was only the beginning of what still needed healing. 6 weeks passed. and Willow Bend, in the particular way small towns do, slowly stitched itself back into something that resembled ordinary life, though nothing about it felt quite the same as it had before. The federal case against Bradford Nash moved fast once it moved at all. He was arraigned on 11 counts, released on bail with an ankle monitor and a house he could no longer sell, waiting on a trial date that legal experts in the Courier-Journal predicted would end almost certainly in a plea deal and several years in federal custody. Ridgeline Partners quietly withdrew every pending offer on Cypress Street, their names suddenly radioactive in 3 counties' worth of local news coverage. The 12 families who'd already sold their homes found, to their considerable relief, that the FBI's investigation opened a path toward compensation and, in several cases, the chance to buy their properties back. Otis Freeman planted tomatoes that spring in the same backyard his wife had planted them in for 40 years, humming something low and tuneless as he worked, entirely at peace. Deputy Roy Halstead requested a transfer to community relations within the department, an unusual move for a man his age, but one that surprised absolutely nobody who'd watched him change in the week since that dawn on Route 60. He showed up most Sundays now to Mount Pisgah's community breakfast, quiet, humble, learning, slowly, the difference between keeping the peace and actually building it. And on Cypress Street, in a little white house with peeling shutters that had, at long last, been repainted a fresh, defiant white, courtesy of a work crew from Iron Kingdom MC who'd shown up unannounced one Saturday with ladders and brushes and refused any payment beyond a home-cooked meal, Jeriah Bellamy sat on the back porch his father built, doing his homework in the fading gold light of a late spring evening. What justice actually looked like. The Sunday after Nash's arraignment, Mount Pisgah AME Zion Church held a special service. Not a celebration exactly, the pastor was careful to say, because there was nothing to celebrate in 12 families nearly losing their homes to a scheme built on greed. But a service of thanksgiving all the same, for truth finding its way to light. Deputy Roy Halstead sat in the back pew that morning, out of uniform, hat in his lap, looking distinctly unsure whether he belonged there at all. It was Otis Freeman, of all people, who spotted him hovering near the door and waved him forward with his cane. "Come on in here, son," Otis said, loud enough for half the congregation to hear. "Ain't no sense standing at the back of a room you already decided to walk into." Halstead sat beside him, stiff and uncertain, through the whole service. The singing, the pastor's sermon on Zacchaeus and the nature of repentance, the prayers offered up for the 12 families still working to rebuild what Nash's scheme had cost them. Afterward, over the community breakfast in the fellowship hall, he found himself at a table with Adaze and Jeriah, awkwardly working through a plate of grits and fried catfish he'd been handed without quite being asked if he wanted it. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Bellamy," he said finally, setting down his fork. "That night at the diner, the way I looked at your son, at Preacher, I brought assumptions into that room I had no business bringing. I'm sorry." Adaeze studied him a long moment, the particular assessing look of a woman who'd learned to separate performance from real change. "Apology accepted, Deputy. The question now is what you do with it." "I've requested a transfer," Halstead said. "Community relations. I want to actually know this town, not just patrol it." He hesitated. "I'd like to keep showing up here if that's all right. Not to make a show of it, just because I think I've got some catching up to do." Jeriah, working through his own plate of grits, looked up at him with the plain, uncomplicated honesty of an 11-year-old. "My daddy used to say people aren't finished being who they're going to be until they're dead. Preacher told me that. Said my dad believed everybody had time to become better, long as they were still breathing." Halstead blinked hard, something working behind his eyes. "Your daddy sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Jeriah said simply. "I'm still learning how wise, honestly. Feels like every week somebody tells me something new." Halstead did keep showing up. Not every week, but often enough that by the time winter came, nobody in the fellowship hall thought twice about setting a plate for him. It wasn't a fast redemption, or a clean one, but it was real, built one Sunday breakfast at a time, and Willow Bend's black community, cautious with good reason, but not without grace, slowly made room for it. The mirror. The mason jar sat on the mantel now, in the front room, moved there deliberately by Adaeze the week after everything happened. It no longer held cash, and it no longer wore its old masking tape label reading New Sneakers, September. Jeriah had peeled that label off himself carefully the day after the riders left, and replaced it with a new one, written in his same careful handwriting, Dad's letter. Inside sat the folded, worn envelope, and beside it, carefully wrapped in the same soft cloth Delacroix Guillory had used, the small wooden cross Emeka Bellamy had carved with his own hands in a war zone half a world away, now returned home to sit beside the words that had traveled just as far to reach his son. It wasn't dollars anymore. It was something money had never been able to buy in the first place. Proof, physical and permanent, that a father's love could outlast even death itself if it was carried faithfully enough by the right hands for long enough. Preacher visited most months now, riding down from wherever Iron Kingdom's business took him, always finding time to sit on that back porch with Jeriah and tell him another story about Emeka Bellamy, the mechanic who could fix anything with wire and patience, the sergeant who made the whole unit laugh even in the worst weeks, the friend who never once, in 8 months of deployment together, let fear stop him from doing the right thing. "Tell me the one about the generator again," Jeriah said this particular evening, closing his math homework, the September sun sliding low and warm across the porch boards. The same boards, the story didn't need to remind anyone, where a mountain of a man had once knelt in gratitude before a boy in plaid pajamas. Preacher, sitting in the chair beside him with a glass of Adiz's sweet tea sweating in his hand, chuckled low and settled in to tell it again, the way you tell a favorite story to someone you love. Not because they haven't heard it, but because hearing it again is its own kind of homecoming. Daisy stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the two of them, dish towel still in her hands, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 4 long years finally, gently, begin to loosen. Her husband hadn't come home. That grief never fully left, and she'd stopped expecting it to. But some essential part of him, his steadiness, his generosity, the particular quiet courage that made him who he was, had found its way home after all, carried 7 years and 230 miles by a promise one broken, grateful man refused to let go of. And it had planted itself, whole and unmistakable, in the heart of an 11-year-old boy who'd once given away his last $7 to a stranger, simply because that stranger looked like somebody's daddy. He'd been more right than he ever could have known. September. Finally. Later that September, the same month that Mason Jar had once been saving toward, a package arrived at the little white house on Cypress Street. No return address, postmarked from a sporting goods distributor in Louisville. Inside, a brand new pair of sneakers, exactly Jeriah's size, exactly the pair he'd circled quietly in a catalog 8 months earlier, and never once mentioned wanting out loud, because wanting things out loud wasn't something the Bellamy household did easily. Tucked inside the box, a small note in Ruth Iron's blunt, practical handwriting. "A man doesn't walk into his future in worn-out shoes. Iron Kingdom's got your back, kid. Always will." Jeriah wore them to the first day back at school, and when Mrs. Petrakis, his teacher, asked the class to share something they were proud of over the summer, he stood up at his desk and told them, not about the sneakers, not even really about the 300 motorcycles or the mayor's arrest, though those parts got their due mention too, but about a letter his father wrote him before he died, and what it taught him about what kind of man he wanted to grow into. The classroom was quiet a long moment after he finished. Then his best friend Terrell, sitting 2 rows over, raised his hand. "Can we hear it?" Terrell asked. "The letter, I mean, if you don't mind sharing." Jeriah thought about it, thought about his father's careful handwriting, thought about the particular privacy of something that had traveled so far and cost so much to arrive. "Maybe someday," he said. "It's still kind of mine right now." Mrs. Petrakis, watching from the front of the room, understood exactly what he meant, and nodded, and moved gently on to the next student, letting the moment settle the way important moments deserve to settle, without being rushed toward a neat conclusion. At recess that day, Terrell caught up with Jeriah by the fence, still turning the story over in his head. "So wait," he said, "you're telling me you gave that whole biker your entire sneaker money? All of it? For a stranger?" "He was hurt, Terrell. Nobody else was going to help him. But what if it didn't work out? What if he was just some regular dude and nothing ever came of it?" Jeriah thought about that seriously, the way he thought about most things, turning it over like a stone in his pocket. "Then I still would have helped a hurt man get home safe," he said finally. "That part was never about what I'd get back. My mama always says you don't do right hoping something good happens to you for it. You just do right because it's right. The good stuff, that's extra. That's not the reason." Terrell was quiet a moment, chewing on that with the seriousness only an 11-year-old processing a genuinely new idea could manage. "That's deep, man," he said finally. "Your dad really wrote you all that in one letter?" "Some of it," Jeriah said, smiling a little. Some of it I think I already knew. The letter just kind of confirmed it. They went back to their game after that, the way kids do. The enormous weight of the conversation settling into something lighter, carried forward without needing to be carried heavily. Miss Ruthie's one more time. That same week, Adaze stopped into Miss Ruthie's on her way home from a rare daytime shift and found Delphine behind the counter, same as always, wiping down the counter with the particular efficient rhythm of a woman who'd done the same motion 10,000 times. "Girl, come sit," Delphine said, already pouring a cup of coffee before Adaze had even settled onto a stool. "How's my favorite family in this whole town doing?" "We're doing," Adaze said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it fully for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Really doing, Delphine, not just getting by." Delphine studied her a moment, then reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. "You know, the night that man came in here bleeding, soaked clean through, I didn't know what I was looking at. Just saw somebody's child doing the right thing when it would have been so much easier not to." She shook her head, slow, wonder still fresh in her voice weeks later. "Never in my life did I imagine it would unravel into all this. The mayor, the FBI, 300 motorcycles parked on Cypress Street like the Lord's own army come to make things right." "Sometimes," Adaze said, wrapping both hands around her warm coffee cup, "I think that's exactly how grace works. Quiet and small, right up until the moment it isn't anymore." Delphine nodded slow, and for a moment the two women sat together in comfortable silence, two neighbors who'd weathered a strange and remarkable season side by side, grateful. In the specific way survivors of something hard are grateful, simply to be sitting in the ordinary hum of a Tuesday afternoon diner again. A final evening on the porch. The story that started with a flash, a man on his knees, a boy with a jar, 300 motorcycles filling a quiet street at dawn, closes now the way most true stories do. Quietly on an ordinary evening, with the extraordinary parts folded gently into the fabric of everyday life. Jariah sat on the back porch steps as the sun went down that September evening, new sneakers on his feet, the mason jar visible through the window behind him on the mantel, holding not money but memory. Preacher's motorcycle sat parked at the curb, and inside the house, his mother's laughter carried out through the screen door, easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in a very long time. Preacher settled down on the step beside him, the porch boards creaking under his weight, the same way they'd creaked under Emeka Bellamy's weight years before, when he built them with his own two hands for exactly this purpose, a place for family to sit together and watch the evening come down soft and gold over Willow Bend. "You did good, son," Preacher said quietly, looking out at the street. "Your daddy's proud. I know it in my bones." Jariah was quiet a moment, turning something over in his mind. "Preacher? Do you think he knew? That night, when he made you promise, do you think he knew somehow that I'd grow up to be the kind of person who'd stop for a stranger?" Preacher considered the question with the weight it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "your daddy knew exactly what kind of woman raised you and exactly what kind of heart she'd pass down. He didn't need to see the future, son. He just needed to trust the foundation he was leaving behind. And Lord, did he ever trust right?" They sat together a long while in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade gold, then rose, then deep and settled blue over the rooftops of Cypress Street, a street that had, in one remarkable dawn, revealed both the worst and the very best of what a small town could hold. A word to you, watching. There's a question worth sitting with. Once a story like this one settles into your heart the way it settled into Willow Bend. Jariah Bellamy had exactly $7 in this world, and a stranger, soaked and bleeding and unwanted by everyone else in that gas station lot. He had every reason in the world to walk on by, to protect what little he had, to mind his business the way so many grown adults chose to that same rainy night. Instead, he gave everything he had, without hesitation, without calculation, simply because a hurting man in front of him looked, to a boy who missed his own father fiercely, like somebody's daddy. He had no way of knowing what that kindness would return to him. He wasn't kind because he expected anything back. That's the whole heart of it, isn't it? The purest kindness never keeps score. And yet it came back to him anyway. Not as an accident, not as luck, but as the natural echo of a debt that had been waiting 7 long years for the right moment to be repaid. So here's the question, and I'd love for you to sit with it a minute before you scroll on. What would you have done, standing in that rain, with your own last $7 in your pocket? Would you have walked past, like so many did that night, Or would you have crossed the street the way Jiraiya did, trusting that some kindnesses are worth giving even when, especially when, you have no idea what they might cost you or what they might someday bring home? If this story moved you even half as much as it moved the 300 riders who showed up at dawn to honor a promise 7 years in the keeping, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what's the smallest act of kindness you ever witnessed that turned out to carry the biggest weight? And if you know somebody who needs a reminder today that goodness always, eventually, finds its way home, go on and share this with them. Because somewhere out there tonight, there's another Jiraiya standing in the rain deciding whether or not to cross the street. Let's make sure they know it's always, always worth it. Thank you for watching. Until the next story, take care of each other. End.